Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jordan Ben-Shia. I'm the Executive Director of the VIN Foundation. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm going to give you a little bit of an intro before I turn the webinar over. A couple of housekeeping things. So within the next couple days, for all of you that have registered for this webinar, you'll be receiving an email with a recording of this webinar along with additional information, including helpful resource links and other information that Dr. Bartels is going to be speaking about this evening. So keep a lookout for the email, and if you have any questions, please email studentdebt@vinfoundation.org. I will also be putting that in the chat window for everyone to see. Another piece of housekeeping information, during this webinar, we will be asking a couple poll questions, and we will also have the opportunity for you to ask questions throughout the webinar. And there is a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And if you click that, you can ask a question. And we've also allowed for this webinar where you can upvote for a question that you think might be important or one that you want to make sure is answered, as well as comment. So please make sure that you go in there and ask any questions that you feel are not being answered during the webinar, and we will get to them. And if we're not able to get to all of them, we will make sure they are answered in the follow-up information as well. So a little bit about the VIN Foundation. Most foundations give money, and the VIN Foundation gives resources. We believe a healthy animal community depends on a healthy veterinary community, and our resources help veterinarians. Each of our resources are available to all pre-vets, veterinary students, and veterinarians at no cost. And we are regularly updating the resources with the most up-to-date information, and we're here to help. And probably through the registration and different links that you've gotten to for the webinar, you've seen that we are thrilled to be collaborating with both the APVMA and the Student Doctor Network on this webinar. We all have a big passion for helping pre-veterinary students and giving them the most helpful information. A little bit about the APVMA. The American Pre-Veterinary Medical Association, also known as APVMA, is a national organization for students. Their goal is to promote and stimulate interest in the field of veterinary medicine, provide open communication between pre-veterinary clubs and organizations nationally, provide resources to students on pursuing the field of veterinary medicine, and hold the annual National APVMA Symposium. A little bit about Student Doctor Network. They bring together thousands of current and future healthcare students and professionals into one community where they can share information, offer guidance, and provide encouragement to their peers and those coming up behind them. Whether considering a gap year, struggling with the intensity of their classes, or navigating the match, SDN members can find someone who understands what they're facing. Again, we're thrilled to be partnering with these two great organizations, with APVMA and Student Doctor Network. It's been really a joy for us. And I'm going to turn you over to tonight's host, Dr. Tony Bartels. He is a VIN Foundation board member and a student debt educator with VIN. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tony.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. And thanks everybody for joining. This is our first kind of live attempt to address pre-veterinary students and give you some information on what we've learned in terms of working with veterinarians and veterinary students. So just to give you a little background, the last almost 10 years now, myself and Paul Payan, the CEO and co-founder of VIN, the Veterinary Information Network, have been really working hard on educating veterinary students and veterinarians on how best to handle their student debt. But most of that involves giving them some strategies once they've already chosen or chose a veterinary school, and also after they've had their they've taken all of their student debt and are entering repayment. Once you're done with veterinary school, or once you're in veterinary school, there's not a lot you can really do about changing that number and making it easier to repay. So if we keep working our way back, we get to you all where we are tonight, right? So while you're applying to veterinary school, or before you actually submit the application, that's when you can really make the biggest dent in your student debt. And we're going to share with you some of what we've learned over the last decade or so to help you apply those strategies to your veterinary school application strategy in a concept that we call Apply Smarter. All right, so let's get into some of the material, right? So this is what we're going to cover tonight. So we really want to help set you up for financial success, right? So we can get really wrapped up. And I know, I mean, I remember when I decided I wanted to go to veterinary school, it was all about getting the application submitted and getting into school. But there has to be a financial consideration as well. We know that more than 80% of the folks who attend veterinary school rely on student loans. So there are certain things that you can do now while you're applying that will help to reduce the amount of student debt that you end up with when you come out as a practicing veterinarian. Some of that just really relies on you knowing some of the numbers, right? And I know that most of us are life science folks, or we've known we wanted to be veterinarians since the time we were 10 years old. And this finance stuff is really not on our high list of things to care about, but we really have to force ourselves to look at it because there's no way around it. So in order to do that, we need to know how much veterinary school costs, where are the differences. Not all vet schools cost the same amount of money. Some of them have some quite different price tags versus others. You also need to know how much a new veterinarian earns, right? Because debt is really not the issue in itself. It's the income that you earn after you finish veterinary school that makes the debt difficult to manage. So we have to consider both the debt and income together, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Then we're also going to address the difference between discounted and non-discounted seats. And you might know that as in-state or out-of-state tuition, but there are some gray areas and areas in between. So the terminology that we like to use is discounted, usually refers to in-state or something that approximates in-state, and then non-discounted, those are going to be your out-of-state private schools, those types of seats that are more expensive. We're going to use application stats to your advantage, right? So if we start to dig into some of the individual school stats, we can see pretty quickly that the way that you apply, or the seats that you're applying for, some of them are going to give you a better chance than others, right? So we're going to show you some of those stats, where to look. I know a lot of people, and the common myth is that it's really hard to get into veterinary school, and it is, but most of that difficulty is fulfilling your prerequisites and making sure that you're a competitive candidate. But there are certain seats that we're going to see that have a pretty high odds ratio in your favor. So we'll cover some of that information. I'm going to share with you a little bit more why I'm so passionate about this, and how I came to really spend most of my time thinking about student debt and how to help people manage that. And that really is because I have a lot of it myself, and I married a veterinarian and she has a lot of it too. So we together have a lot of student debt. I'll share that number with you in a second. And when people come to me for help, I ask them for their student loan history and signalment. And when you get into veterinary school, you're going to learn a lot about what a history and signalment means. It's how you gather all of the information that you're going to need to identify what's wrong with the animals that you're going to be treating. So I'm going to share with you my history and signalment from a student debt standpoint. So I'm a married 2-vet household with no kids yet. We're recent Colorado State University veterinarians. My wife finished before I did in 2009, and I finished from the combined MBA DVM program in 2012. We both use federal student loans to cover our veterinary school costs. In my case, I had some debt from undergraduate school, so I was familiar with student loans before I went to veterinary school. My wife, the first loans that she took out was specifically for veterinary school, and she attended Colorado State as a out-of-state student, so she paid a little bit more than I did. She went on to specialize in small animal internal medicine and practices in Denver, Colorado, and I went the GP route. But together we have more than $400,000 of student loan debt, right? And that's a pretty big number. It definitely makes for some challenges in terms of managing that, but we're really not going to get into a lot of the repayment options because we want to focus more on what you're going to do to minimize the student debt that you might incur on your way through veterinary school. If you're borrowing for undergrad currently, if you already have federal student loans, then I would encourage you to log into the National Student Loan Data System, nslds.ed.gov. That is the official record of your federal student loan borrowing history. If you haven't started borrowing student loans yet, and you are going to for vet school, then you will have a record with the NSLDS, but it won't start until after you take that first loan. So if you don't have any loans yet, file that away to use once you start borrowing. If you do have student loans, I would encourage you to jump over to the National Student Loan Data System even tonight if you want to see what's in there. And then some of the tools that we built on VIN Foundation that are freely available for anybody to use work with that NSLDS data that you can download from the National Student Loan Data System. Right, so we'll show you what some of those tools look like a little bit later in the session. All right, so now I'm going to get into the polls, and I want to know a little bit about you on the first one. So I'm going to launch this one, and hopefully you can see the choices there. Go ahead and select those, so that way I can bake some more specifics into this particular session. Cool, got about 80% of you responded so far. Give it another 15 seconds or so, see if we can encourage more of you to respond. All right, I'm going to end that there. And I'll share the results with you. So you should see the results. So it looks like we've got about 49% of folks who are applying to this active cycle, right? So that probably very familiar with VMCAS, and that's going to close this September for the class entering next fall. And then we've got the other bulk of folks who will be applying in the future, 39%, and then the rest is kind of a smattering of other folks who are interested in learning more about this apply smarter concept. So thank you again for joining, and I'm glad to see that almost half of you are kind of in the midst of that application process and may not have hit that final submit button yet. So hopefully you can use some of that information that we're going to cover the rest of this evening. All right, so next poll I'm going to have, so we're going to have some of these polls here are going to come back to back here, but I want to test some of your knowledge before I start sharing you some of the data that I have. So I want to kind of know what we're starting with. So go ahead and please answer this second polling question. How much will it cost you to become a veterinarian? And don't get hung up too much on, you know, should I include all my debt or not all my debt? I mean, if you've already borrowed some student loans from undergrad, then include that in what you think it'll cost you in total to become a veterinarian. The key word here is a key phrase actually is how much will it cost you to become a veterinarian, right? So you want to add up all of the amounts that you think it's going to take. All right, I'm going to end that one here. Share this with you all. And we're going to use this answer later on in the session as well. So great. So we've got a good distribution there of answers. So it looks like the majority of you think it's going to cost somewhere between that $200,000 and $300,000 range. It's probably not too far off. Some of you higher up. Yeah, I'm not really sure. That's why I'm here. Thanks for sharing that with your honesty. I mean, that's exactly, we're going to cover some of that tonight. All right, and the polls are kind of front loaded in this lecture. So I've got a couple more here because again, as I touched on earlier, we can't really talk about debt without talking about income as well. I'm going to ask you how much you think veterinarians make after they graduate. we'll give you a couple more seconds here. I'll share these results with you. All right, so this is great because this is a theme that I see is quite common in veterinary medicine, is that most veterinarians, particularly those who are getting started, chronically undervalue what they are worth. And this does not help with the student debt situation, right? Because the way that you service your student debt is from the income you earn as a veterinarian, right? So you want to make sure that you're earning what the market will bear. And we'll share with you some of the recent data from the graduating classes to tell you what you can expect to earn as a veterinarian. But I will say that the 52% of you that guess between 50 and 70,000 are you're undervaluing what current new grad veterinarians are earning out there in general, right? There's a wide range of what veterinarians earn, and we can talk more about that later. But in general, it's going to be a little bit higher than that $50,000 to $70,000 range. And I have one last one for you, and then we'll get on with the additional content. And how are you primarily deciding which veterinary schools to apply to? Let me see if I can get to this poll here. Sorry. All right, so I launched this fourth poll. How are you primarily deciding which veterinary schools to apply to? All right, we'll let that run a few more seconds. See if we can get up to that 80% or so as we've been getting. For those of you that are contributing, thank you again. I'll go ahead and end that one here. All right, so we've got 24% or so that are applying to the curriculum they're most interested in, 26% based on cost and affordability. That's great. That's largely what Apply Smarter is all about. And then 23% or so to increase your odds of acceptance. So let's compare. We've actually asked this question in the past, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to rerun this poll. We asked this question to students and wanted to see how it stacks up against your responses, and we can see that other than the applying to schools in the area that I want to live, I see some similar distributions. I do see that I'm applying to schools based on cost and affordability is a little bit higher now than it was about 5 years ago, which is great to see, right? I think that we need to see more of that, especially since some of the student debt numbers that we see for new graduates can be difficult to manage. All right, great. Thank you again for that. And we'll come back to some of those polls a little bit later this evening. All right, so big picture, this is why we're doing this, right? And there are a lot of other webinars out there, and AAVMC has got a lot of great data in the VIMcast about the logistics of actually applying, but I feel like we don't talk enough about student debt to income with pre-veterinary students specifically when they're applying, right? So I'm gonna share some of that information with you. So this is one of the reasons why Paul and I are so busy when we talk to folks about student debt. And then we see here that we have a lot of, we have income distributed right around that somewhere between $75,000, $80,000, $90,000 range. Then we have another peak here around the $30,000. Those are folks that graduate and go on to do internships and residencies. But if you go after you graduate and you don't do an internship or residency and you go on to private clinical practice, you can stand to earn somewhere between that $75,000, $80,000 range, right? And that's going to be the income that you're going to use to pay back your student debt, among other things, right? But we can see that the student debt is widely distributed, right? So most of it is centered around this $150,000 to $200,000 range, but then it goes all the way out here with some little blips past this $495,000 range. So we have a huge distribution of student debt. So your possibilities of ending up with a student debt number that's quite a bit higher than your income is that probability is quite high, right? And that makes repaying your student debt very difficult, particularly in the early stages after finishing veterinary school. This is just a little closer view of that. And I want to reiterate something that when I've talked to pre-veterinary students in the past, there is this perception that if you pay more for your education, that you'll earn it back, right? That somehow that, you know, kind of what I call this Harvard effect. If you were to go to Harvard and pay a lot of money for your education, you're going to command a higher income when you finish. Unfortunately, we do not see that effect in veterinary medicine. There is no significant difference in the data that we currently have available that shows that the school that you attend garners you higher or lower income across the board. There is, however, a significant difference among the veterinary school seat type, and that, so whether you attend as an in-state student, an out-of-state student, somewhere in between, or attend a private school, and student debt, right? So the higher student debt numbers we see are definitely from those out-of-state and private school tuition structures. So what does that mean, right? So it means that generally anybody that graduates from any of the vet schools that we currently have and is able to pass the licensing exam stands to earn the market rate that veterinarians earn, which was that income that was centered around somewhere between that $75,000 and $90,000 range. That's what the market is currently paying for new graduate veterinarians, right? So if you're not going to be paid more for paying more for your education, you should be focused on paying the least amount that you possibly can for your veterinary education. So if we look at some of the debt by school, so this information is publicly available as well, and it's sourced here. You can see this is from the AAVMC. This is for 2018 graduates, the most recent data that we have available. We can see that the institutions, the schools that reported debt, for those folks who did have student debt was about 177,000, but we also see quite a variation, right? So this is some of the newest schools. This is Midwestern. This is the vet school, Royal Dick School in England. This is Western, St. George's, Lincoln Memorial, Ross, Penn is a private school, Maisie in New Zealand. These folks don't have a way of paying a discounted tuition rate. So if they're borrowing student loans, it makes sense that they're going to graduate with a much higher amount of debt than the average, right? But then we have most of the state schools down here that have lower than average reported student debt, and that's because there's a higher proportion of them either borrowing less or attending as residents of those particular states, or were somehow able to obtain in-state rates for their tuition. To categorize this a little bit better, I think this is one of the most useful graphs that we've seen come out of the AVMA recently, and it gives you an idea of what your cost profile would be depending on the types of schools that you're applying to, right? So public are your state schools, and resident, so if you're applying as an in-state resident of your state school, you have the opportunity to borrow the least amount of money and graduate with the least amount of debt. However, if you're attending a foreign, Caribbean, or a private school, as you know, because private, non-resident, resident really doesn't matter, you're still paying the same rate as everybody else there. You're going to borrow more money, right? And we see the most money being borrowed by those Caribbean schools, and it also applies to the foreign schools. We just don't have data from the foreign school graduates outside of some of the Caribbean schools yet. Now, again, we can't talk about debt without talking about income. This data is also available. The most recent data we have available for is 2017 graduates, and this is where we can see from the various schools what the average starting salary, excluding those who go on to do internships or advanced education. So these are all folks who are going on to do private, corporate, public, clinical practice. We can see what their average salaries are per school. right? And we can see here that there's not any significant difference. It ranges between 72 to about 82 for the Texas A&M grads there. And then if we go down to the next half, we still have about the same dynamic. We have an 89 here for Tuskegee, right? So, but the average for all of the schools, at least the US schools, is about $76,000 is the average reported starting salary, right? And the takeaway there is that the starting income does not differ significantly by school, right? So that is what I mean numerically when we say that there's no Harvard effect when it comes to veterinary school. Just as a little bit of an update, the average salary, we don't have it by school yet, but the average salary for 2018 grads going into private clinical practice was a bit higher, right? So 82,000 versus the 77,000 that we had in 2017. So that's a good sign that incomes are increasing for new graduates. And then roughly 34,000 for those folks who go on to do internships. But we won't have that per school data available until later this fall. Usually October, November is when that comes out.
Tony, just since you're at the income level
Sure.
session, so a couple people have a question of how easy is it to get a job as a new grad to have room to negotiate salary?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So right now, I will say that in the current environment, it's almost never been better to be coming out of veterinary school, right? So the private practices can't find enough veterinarians and they can't get their hands on new grads fast enough, which puts you in the driver's seat, right? So when the demand for you is high, you can command more, right? So you can get a better salary, better benefits, you'll have more options. I mean, that is a great position to be in. Now, that changes. When I graduated in 2012, it was one of the worst years to come out as a veterinary student because we were in the midst of the last recession. Veterinary practices were not particularly looking for new graduates, so it was much harder to find a job, right? So you didn't have the command of the salaries and benefits that you have now. Hopefully that will stay the same over the next 4 years, 5 years, depending on when you're going to graduate from veterinary school, but you can't really predict that, right? So it really depends on what the market conditions are going to be when you're approaching graduation from vet school. Again, right now, never been a better time to be graduating from veterinary school, but hopefully that stays the same, but cycles do happen. It goes up and down. So it depends on where you're going to be in that cycle.
And a couple other questions about income.
Sure.
What does the type of animals you treat, small, large, exotic, factor into how much you'll make a year?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I don't have that data in this particular presentation tonight, but we do have that data available, right? So the majority of folks who graduate veterinary school go on to practice small animal private practice. And that's usually what determines some of these salaries because it's the greatest number, right? So I mean, and I see a lot of new graduate income data because I help a lot of them with their student debt. And for those folks who go on to do private small animal practice in a urban setting, so in cities, it can be quite high. It can be much higher than at 82,000 right now. I mean, it can get up to 90, 100, 110 for that particular sector of veterinary medicine. However, the same is not true across all areas of veterinary medicine. So equine practitioners tend to start out at a lower rate, right? So the average equine starting salary is somewhere around $50,000, $55,000, right? So it's quite a bit lower. Mixed animal is usually quite a bit lower than private small animal practice. Food animal can sometimes be higher or equivalent to private small animal practice, depending on the environment that you end up. But if it's a small rural practice, it might not be as high, right? So really what we tend to see is in the rural areas, the incomes are not as high as they are in the urban areas, and private small animal practice tends to command the highest salaries, particularly in the emergency medicine realm. So it does vary quite a bit. You can find that data. Those are also in these same reports that I've quoted. So the 2018 AVMA AAVMC report on the market for veterinary education, if you check that out in the library, it will actually show you some of the breakdowns by veterinary practice type for starting salaries.
One other question is, do these average salaries include internships?
These do not, right? So the numbers I'm showing in here do not. So internships, they don't change too much, right? And that's really what I've got illustrated here. That's that roughly somewhere between 25 and 35,000 is going to be your average internship starting salary. There's a handful of private practice internships that will pay a little bit more than that, but for the most part, you can expect to earn somewhere around that $35,000 mark as an intern after veterinary school.
I think that's about it for right now. I think you're going to cover some of these other questions.
Great. Cool. Great questions. All right. So last poll, I swear. So fifth question. This has to do with your comfort level around debt. And this helps me understand a little bit more too, how to counsel you best on applying. All right. Let it run for another 10 or 15 seconds here. We're almost up to our 80% threshold for poll responses. All right. Might not quite make it there for this one. All right, so here I'm going to share you the results here. So 20% of you have never had student debt. That's quite common, right? So a lot of folks who start veterinary school, the first time they're exposed to student loans is when they hit veterinary school. I see a lot of folks that want to get rid of it as fast as possible. Can be difficult, but if you borrow less, if you apply some of these apply smarter concepts, you might be able to do that. And then the majority of folks feel that they'll need to take on student debt, but they feel confident they can manage a reasonable amount, which is quite doable, right? But reasonable is a bit of a fuzzy word. Reasonable for some is not necessarily reasonable for others. So we can talk a little bit more about that too, in terms of what happens if you get to the higher numbers. Thanks again for contributing to those polls. All right, so how are you going to apply smarter, right? So when you apply to veterinary school, and as half of you indicated you're applying to this cycle, I have to believe that you've come across the Association of American Veterinary Medical Colleges, AAVMC, who actually manages the Veterinary Medical College Application Service, or VIMCAS, right? So this is the application portal to the majority of veterinary schools. I think Texas A&M is an outlier. There's a few other schools that will also require supplemental applications or not use VIMCAS altogether. But for the most part, if you're applying to veterinary school, you are going to go through the VIMCAS portal. How do you apply smarter? So this is really thinking beyond the transcripts, the prereqs. I saw a question in there about transcripts and such, but that's really not what we're going to be focused on tonight, right? So this is a kind of a beyond that sort of thing, right? So there are a lot of webinars that deal with those sorts of things. You can get those answers directly from the AAVMC, or better yet, the school that you're going to apply directly to. But what I want to talk about is a lot about the things that the schools and other folks are not talking about, right? And that's the costs and the odds and all the things that are going to affect you for the next 20 or 25 years during repayment of your student debt. So pay less and reduce your stress, right? So considering your cost, I mean, just being here tonight, you're already taking a huge leap in looking at the numbers, what it costs to become a veterinarian, right? These are not things that we generally want to face while we're in that excitable phase of thinking about being a veterinarian. But you have to answer some simple questions first. Where do you want to go and why, right? Why do you want to go to the school that's your number one choice? Are you going to need to borrow student loans in order to finish that program, right? That's going to be a huge component. If you need to borrow student loans, then the next questions are, and that was kind of what the last poll was about, does student debt stress you out, right? For those of you who want to get rid of your debt as fast as possible, I think about a quarter of you indicated that you want to get rid of your any debt that you have as fast as possible, then you definitely want to apply to a school that's going to allow you to borrow the below average amount of student debt, right? Because one of the only ways that you're going to be able to pay that debt off as fast as you possibly can is by having a lower than average amount. So the next question is there a discounted tuition rate for you? Is there some way for you to obtain an in-state or something that approximates an in-state tuition rate? What are your estimated living expenses? We'll talk about that, right? So it's not just about tuition and fees. You also have to be able to pay for all of the things that you're going to need to live as a veterinary student while you're navigating the veterinary program, right? Some of you are going to be able to have jobs. A lot of you won't, right? So it can be quite taxing. The 24 credit hours a semester is not really conducive to working in many cases, right? So you have to find a pretty flexible work option that's going to allow you to make it worth your time to do something like that. Do you have family assistance, right? We're going to talk a little bit about what that means and how you can best use that. Some of the most common stressors and questions I get from already graduated folks is, my parents want to help me pay my student loans. Well, that's great. And that's a wonderful position to be in, but the way that they could have helped the most is by paying some of your tuition while you were in vet school. Right, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. Scholarship grant options, those are quite variable as well. Some schools are better than providing those options than others. Generally, the state schools are going to have more scholarship and grant opportunities for you to pursue. There's not a lot of them out there, so you want to research those before you apply and make sure you're asking those schools that are on your short list about those options that are available. VetSchoolBound.org is going to have some of this information to help you wade through the schools and look at them and categorize them as you're kind of creating that short list. And then I alluded to earlier, the VIN Foundation.org Student Debt Center, the ISLE is actually your in-school loan estimator. So if you do need to borrow student loans, you can actually run that through the in-school loan estimator to give you an idea of how much it's going to cost you. And that's what we're going to talk about next. One thing before we jump off of here is one of the common questions that usually comes up, or one of the comments, it's not even a question, it's more of a comment, is, hey, I don't live in a state where I have access to a veterinary school, right? There's no way for me to obtain in-state tuition. And that may be true. However, there is always a way for you to obtain some form of a discounted tuition rate, right? By catering to the schools that allow you to maybe switch your residency status after the first year. And there's a handful of schools that do that, right? So even if you have to pay out of state for the first year, paying an in-state rate for the next 3 years after that is much better than paying the full out-of-state rate for the full 4 years, right? So there is always a way for you to cater your application strategy to include those schools that allow you to obtain a discounted tuition, no matter where you live in the United States. So back to this graph, right? So this is what I think is a huge, it just goes a long way in terms of helping to understand your cost profile, what I call your cost profile, right? So you want to start with your in-state public school, right? So public, resident, that's going to give you the lowest possible cost profile, right? Or any school that you have the option to obtain that in-state rate. So, right, so there's this WICHE, Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education. For those states out west that do not have a veterinary school, they often have partnerships with some of the Western veterinary schools to allow you to obtain an in-state rate. And then we have the Southern Regional Education Board. So that has more to do with the southeastern states. Same thing, right? Not all of those states have a veterinary school, but some of them have some arrangements with states that do, that allow you to obtain in-state tuition. There's also something that's relatively new in veterinary medicine are these 2+2 programs. Probably the most famous one is the one between Nebraska. Nebraska does not have a veterinary school, but they have a 2+2 program with Iowa State, right? So the first 2 years you do in Nebraska, the following 2 years you finish up at vet school at Iowa State, but you're paying the in-state rate for those 4 years. Right, so that's an opportunity, just an example of folks who live in Nebraska can obtain in-state tuition at Iowa State.
Tony, there's one question here that's getting a lot of votes, and
Sure.
that is, what is a standard amount of financial aid offered by vet schools? I know it varies a lot, but would you say it's easy to get something?
Yeah, so we're going to cover, I'm going to give you an example of a financial aid award in just a few minutes. So we're going to cover that one really, really quick here. So just hold on that one. But there's kind of a standard, but it depends on the school, and we'll talk about that in a second. If you need a lower cost option, right? So this really only gives you, if you're going to start with your in-state public school, that often only gives you one option. But I did allude to just a few seconds ago that there are a handful of state schools that allow you to obtain in-state tuition after the first year. Missouri, North Carolina State, Ohio State, UC Davis, Washington State. Those are all schools that after you pay that first year as a non-resident, you can apply for residency during vet school, and now you'll pay the in-state rate for the next 3 years. Texas A&M has a very limited number of out-of-state seats. However, the word on the street is if you maintain a B average as a non-resident at Texas A&M, they will cover the difference between your out-of-state rate and your in-state tuition. So that is another alternative as well for those folks who really want to strive for that in-state tuition. So this lower cost option puts you in a cost profile that lives somewhere between this resident and non-resident state school profile, right? So you may not be able to get the lowest one, but if you're paying out of state for the first year and in state for the next 3 years, you'll probably end up somewhere in between these two cost profile categories, right? And your goal, at least in the Apply Smarter world, is to stay on the left side of this graph, right? Because if you attend one of these private Caribbean schools, your cost profile puts you into this category when you're using student loans, just because it costs more to attend there and it costs more to live there. So let's take a peek at the cost of education map and show you how you can actually rank some of these schools by cost, right? So if you guys have not seen this before, right? So this is on vetschoolbound.org, the cost of education map. And we're really focused again on the financial aspect of this because we really want you to get a head start when you graduate. So you can choose your state of residence. All right, so let's pick a populated state. And we're going to then show you, we're going to rank them, 1 being the lowest cost option, all the way up to 50 being the higher cost option, based on where you live, right? So New Jersey is one of those classic states. I picked that one on purpose too, because there's not really an in-state option, right? But you can start to see what your options are ranked by cost. And what tends to happen is we see these schools like North Carolina State, here we have Tuskegee, then we have Washington State. Those tend to be the schools that pop up lower on the list because at least North Carolina State, Washington State, they allow you to obtain residency after the first year that you paid. Now, if you want, maybe this is the cost of attendance. We're going to cover that in a second. And that was the question about, is there a standard amount that you're allowed to get in student loans? And that has to do with what is called your cost of attendance, right? So if you borrowed your full cost of attendance, the numbers on this map illustrate what your cost would be if you were starting school this fall, right? So if you were just going to focus on the tuition, let's say that you had money saved up or you're planning on working while you're in veterinary school, or you have some family assistance to cover your living expenses, and you just want to focus on the tuition, right, aspect of it, it'll re-rank them by just the tuition and fees, right? So here we see North Carolina State, UC Davis, Washington State, Missouri, Texas A&M. So all those schools that I listed as kind of anybody can apply to those in order to receive a lower cost profile, no matter where you live, in this case, a New Jersey resident, you can still obtain a veterinary education, at least just considering tuition, even if you don't live in those states. All right, I'm going to move this out of the way. And then we're going to get to the question about financial aid. All right, so the cost of attendance. What is the cost of attendance? That is your tuition and fees and your living expenses, right? So that's what sets the amounts that you're allowed to borrow, right? So what the school publishes for their tuition and fees, and they also have to include amounts to account for living expenses, that's what sets how much you can borrow. So you can go to the studentloans.gov and look for the free application for federal student aid, or FAFSA. That's what's going to allow you to apply for student loans. And veterinary school, you are in the graduate professional student category, right? So you are considered to be independent. So and that matters because if you have borrowed some student loans for your undergrad education, you know that they're going to want a lot of information about your parents' assets and income. When you get to the graduate and professional school level, they don't really care about your parents' information anymore. They treat you all as independents, right? So what sets your, and unless you have a unique situation where you're already kind of independently wealthy before you're applying to veterinary school, chances are you're going to be eligible to borrow up to the cost of attendance, right? And I'm going to use Colorado State because I attended Colorado State as an example. This is what Colorado State publishes for their cost of attendance for this coming fall, right? And these are the tuition and fees. We can see there, and I wanted to highlight here this non-resident rate, right? So this is quite common for the state schools. So the residents of Colorado get to pay this $38,000 tuition and fee rate, while the non-residents pay this $61,000 rate, right? So just for attending Colorado State as a non-resident, you'll pay $100,000 more to have that non-resident seat over the 4 years, right? The living expenses are almost identical. There's a little bit more allocated for your transportation as a non-resident, but this is what's going to set the amount that you're able to borrow in student loans. Your living expenses, this is everything that's pretty much not tuition and fees, right? So off-campus housing, this is what they're going to give you to cover your rent and utilities and all of that kind of miscellaneous living expenses. Books and supplies, usually based on how many credit hours you take. Transportation is just to get to and from school. Health insurance, a lot of the schools will require that you have health insurance. If you're still on your parents' insurance, oftentimes you can get this waived and you won't have to borrow that, but you'll have to check with your school. And then they usually throw in this other educational cost as kind of a fudge factor to cover whatever else isn't in there. So this is what sets the amounts that you're able to borrow after you apply for student loans. From that, they're going to pull from this graduate professional student category the types of student loans that you're eligible to use. And the predominant student loan types that you're going to have access to during veterinary school are federal direct unsubsidized loans and federal direct plus loans, right? So that's going to make up the majority of your financial aid award. There are some health profession student loans specifically for health professions, right? So veterinary school is a health profession. So these will vary by school, almost only available at the state schools, not all state schools, but most state schools have access to them. You will have to include your parents' financial information to have access to those on the FAFSA form. And then they will determine whether or not you can use those based on a need and the amount that they have in the pot for that particular school. Same applies for the loans for disadvantaged students. So your predominant financial aid is going to be made up of these direct loans. If you're lucky, you might get some of these health profession student loans or loans for disadvantaged students. If you're really lucky or you're really diligent, you can find some grants and scholarships, and they'll subtract off the amount of loans that you need by the amount of grants and scholarships that you receive. But put your math geek glasses on here. We're going to do some math and show you how this works, right? So direct unsubsidized loans have a limit. For veterinary school, at least for U.S. veterinary schools, that limit is $40,500 per year. Anything that you need above and beyond that will be filled in by the direct plus loans, right? So in this case, if I'm a resident of Colorado and I borrow the full cost of attendance, $57,000, the first $40,500 is going to come from the direct unsubsidized loans. The remainder is going to come from the plus loans. If I'm a non-resident, still the same limit, $40,500. The majority, in this case, a higher amount is going to come from the plus loans, right? So the plus loans are more expensive. They have a higher interest rate. They have higher fees, right? So the more you dip into the direct plus category, the more it's going to cost you just in interest and fees to get through that program. Not to mention the additional tuition that you're paying because you're a non-resident, right? So you almost get double penalized as a non-resident or attending a private or particularly a foreign school because you're paying higher interest rate and higher fees just for those student loans. And I really want you to be cognizant too of the foreign exclusion, right? So this 40,500 maximum only applies to U.S. schools. If you go to a foreign school, a Caribbean school, UK school, Australian school, your limit in direct unsubsidized loans is 20,500. You can still borrow the full cost of attendance, but now the majority of it falls in this direct plus category. And again, the more that falls into that category, they have higher interest rates, they have higher fees, you're going to have higher costs during repayment for the bulk of those loans. All right, so it's just something to be aware of. This is just how the student loans work, right? I didn't make these rules, I'm just the messenger here, right? But this is currently how this is structured. But knowing how it works, you can take advantage, making sure that you try to apply to those schools that allow you to stay mostly in this direct unsubsidized category and only tap into this plus loan category if absolutely necessary. Family support, better applied upfront than after school, right? So I know, and this is a tough one because, and I'm glad I saw in the polling, in the opening the session, that there was some family members that are attending this. I know that you want to kind of reserve that support for a graduation gift or, you know, whatever the case is, you know, after they finish vet school and now they're Dr. So-and-so, but the best use of those funds is going to be during veterinary school. It reduces the interest that you accrue while you're in school. There's more favorable tax consequences for the person paying the tuition versus paying on the student loans after. And it also will help to just reduce the total cost of that veterinary education. Private and non-federal student loans, I really can't emphasize this enough. I would avoid them at all costs, right? Unless they're subsidized, and a subsidized loan means that they do not accrue interest during school. And even in that case, depending on the type of loan, maybe you might want to consider using that over a federal student loan. The federal student loans just have way too many benefits that make it easier to manage them after school that the private and non-federal loans often do not have. So, and they should be unnecessary anyway, right? So you can always borrow up to the cost of attendance in federal student loans using those direct unsubsidized and grad plus loans. There are very few exceptions to that. You have to have some terrible credit to not be eligible for direct plus loans. And it's really hard to have credit that poor as a, you know, at the age of most veterinary students. So you will be eligible for those direct unsubsidized and plus loans. There's really no need to borrow those private loans. All right, let's talk a little bit about odds. So I want to help you increase your odds of acceptance. I know when I talk to most pre-veterinary students about costs, your eyes start rolling in the back of your heads. And many of you may have already experienced that for tonight. But getting in faster is something that resonates with folks all the time, right? They want to know the quickest way to get in, the easiest way to get in, and they perceive that it's extremely difficult to get into veterinary school. Generally speaking, the states will allocate a high number of seats for those residents of those states, right? So you have a better chance of getting in as a resident of a state school like Colorado, right? So I chose to move to Colorado because when I was looking at my best way to get in, I noticed that they accept a pretty healthy percentage of the in-state applicants, right? And I wanted to make sure that I got in the first time around because I wasn't sure I can afford to wait for a second application cycle. So I moved to Colorado, established residency, and applied the first time as a Colorado State resident because it greatly increased my chances of acceptance. So look for or request those admission stats for the schools that you're applying to. If you have a number 1, 2 choice on your list, make sure if they don't post that information on their website that you're asking the dean's office or the admissions office for those stats. They are available for almost every school. And I've got a couple examples here that I want to share with you, right, just to illustrate this point. So UC Davis, this is for the class that's starting in just a couple of weeks here. These are the admission stats for UC Davis, class of 2023, starting this fall 2019, right? So we can see that 516 California residents applied and 146 of them were offered admission, right? For non-residents, 438 applied, 36 were offered admission, right? This is the number that makes everybody think that veterinary school is really, really hard to get into, right? Is when you throw your hat into the non-resident pool, there's fewer seats available, right? You have to be a better, more competitive candidate to have a shot against those 438 other people that applied. Let's look at the other school, LSU. This one is actually quite striking, right? So 145 Louisiana residents applied. This is for the class that started in the fall of 2018. 65 of them enrolled, right? Those are some pretty darn good odds of getting into LSU if you live in Louisiana. They also have an arrangement for Arkansas residents. Arkansas does not have a veterinary school of its own in that state, but they can achieve in-state tuition at Louisiana State. 40 Arkansas residents applied, 9 got in. Again, some pretty good odds. 589 from outside of Louisiana, 24. Those are some pretty terrible odds, right? So again, which one would you rather put yourself up against? And in every case, almost every case for the state schools, you're going to find that your odds greatly increase if you're applying as a resident of the state where you're hoping to attend veterinary school.
Tony, a couple of people are wondering if it's wise to sit out a year and reapply if they don't get into their in-state school in the first try.
Yeah, I think it is. And, you know, again, knowing those stats, first, if you don't get in, I would sit down and do kind of a debrief with the admissions office and find out why, right? Ask them why they think or where the areas that you need to improve on your application to make yourself a better candidate next time around. But absolutely, I mean, because that's really, you know, what some of the Apply Smarter concept is about. I mean, is leaving off some of those tempting, really expensive schools from the list. Because let's say you live in Louisiana and you didn't get in the first time you applied, but you did apply to a Caribbean school and you received admission, realistically, you're probably not going to pass up that chance, right? But you're probably going to pay 3 to 4 times more for that education. Is it worth waiting another year and applying so you can decrease your costs by 3 or 4 times? I think so, right? But it's really hard to convince somebody who's sitting there with that letter of admission to the more expensive school to do that, right? So I you know, it's really up to you in terms of how you're going to handle that best. But in my opinion, I think you need to leave off some of those more expensive schools from your application list so you're not tempted to chase one of those higher cost seats. But just to reiterate some of these stats, right? So 28% of those folks that applied to at least who've, you know, completed the application in full were accepted or received an offer of admission to UC Davis. 8% of non-residents. LSU, 45% of Louisiana residents were accepted that applied, right? That's crazy. I mean, that is some crazy good odds of getting in, using LSU as an example. 23% of Arkansas residents, pretty good, right? 4% of non-residents. So it's harder to get in as a non-resident to LSU than it is into UC Davis. So look at those stats and look for those stats. I found those to be some of the most eye-opening when I was researching applying to veterinary school and trying to figure out the best way of getting in the first time.
So another person had a question that a couple of people wanted to know, which was, if salary doesn't really make a difference on which school you come from, what is the plus side of attending a higher ranked school?
Higher ranked? Now, but when you say higher ranked, I'm assuming you mean a higher cost. And
higher cost, or a school that's supposed to be a better school.
Yeah, so the supposed to be a better school thing is quite a boondoggle, right? What does that mean exactly? Right. So again, no matter what school you graduate from, no matter what accredited school that you graduate from, and if you're able to sit for the licensing exam and pass it and become a licensed practicing veterinarian in the United States, your salary is determined by the market and the type of practice that you pursue, right? It has nothing to do with the school that you attended to. So you have to ask yourself that question. What am I paying for? And you know what? I would turn around and ask the school that question, right? If I am applying to one of those schools where I'm looking at paying 3 times more than what I would pay for my in-state school, what am I getting for that, right? They need to answer that question for you, right? Because that's the reality is we have not seen any data that shows that people who pay more for their education earn more after they graduate, right? So that's going to be up to you to earn more based on what you learn there and how and where you're able to practice, right? So I think you answered your own question. There really is no financial reason to attend a higher price school.
So a few people are wondering if there's no Harvard effect for starting salaries, is there one for getting internships or residencies?
Yeah, that's a different story. Yeah, so I mean, internships and residencies, there's definitely schools that tend to feed people into internships and residencies at higher or lower rates. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can't get an internship or residency no matter what school you go to, right? A lot of that depends on the type of experience that you demonstrate during school and the context that you make while you're in school, right? So that is really highly dependent on letters of recommendation and the types of research activities and demonstrations of passions for particular areas of veterinary medicine that you're going to want to research while you're in school. But it's really hard to again justify paying a higher rate for your education, knowing that anybody can get any internship and any residency no matter what school they've graduated from if they've demonstrated the proficiencies to do so and the interest to do so, right? So just because you go to Cornell does not guarantee you anything, right? So you will, and I might piss Paul off by saying that one, but you're still going to have to demonstrate that you have a desire and the competencies to navigate that internship and residency afterwards, the same as somebody who graduates from any other school. Right?
Yeah, this is Paul. I think a lot of those stats are driven by the school and what they promote.
Yeah.
Some schools tend to encourage internship more, and others promote more, first day ready for practice, and those schools tend to have fewer people apply for it, internships. So it's hard to really tell from the stats that it's the school that gets you in versus the school that gets you to apply.
Absolutely. All right. So the X factor, right? So this is something that I made important, and I learned as I was figuring out what it meant to apply to veterinary school. So I came to veterinary medicine as a career changer. So in my prior life, I graduated with an undergraduate degree in chemical engineering and worked in corporate finance for several years before I found veterinary medicine. I did not have the prerequisites needed to get into veterinary school. And I certainly didn't have the GPA necessarily that many of you have that are applying from undergraduate directly into veterinary school. So I was already kind of starting behind the 8 ball, but I sat down when I moved to Colorado State. Actually, before I moved to Colorado, I sat down with the Colorado State admissions counselor, Dr. Stewart, and told her that, hey, I'm gonna apply to veterinary school. This is what I have. I showed her my transcripts. This is my experience. This is my background. What do you think about me going to veterinary school here at Colorado State? And she practically laughed at me. She's like, you're never going to get in. Right. And that was a real powerful motivator. I'm like, okay, well, tell me what I need to do to improve myself and improve my application. And I just started doing that. Right. I started taking the prerequisites I needed. I was an old man taking biology 101 with a bunch of 18-year-olds at community colleges just to check the boxes that I needed to satisfy the requirements that CSU needed, right? And I met with Dr. Stewart probably 4 or 5 times again before I submitted that application. I wanted her to see me. I wanted her to see that I was serious about this, and I wanted to make sure that I was on the right path, right? So do not discount that part of it, right? They don't talk about that a lot when you're applying, but make yourself known to these schools that you're interested in, particularly your top choices, right? Meet with them, meet with the folks there, make sure they know who you are. And when your application comes across the desk, it's not just a piece of paper with a name on it that they can't put a face to. This is also a time that you want to start inquiring about scholarships and grants, right? Find out if cost is really a stressor for you. What opportunities does that school have to help you decrease those costs other than providing student loans, right? All of the schools are going to provide student loans. You want to see which schools are going to offer more scholarship and grant opportunities. And in my case too, because I came from the business world, CSU had a combined MBA DVM program, right? So I came from the business world. I was kind of a business geek as it turned out. And they had that combined program, and they don't get a lot of applicants to those programs because, quite honestly, there's not a lot of pre-veterinary students that have the business backgrounds necessary to apply for those programs, right? So I was increasing my chances not only of being a Colorado resident by the time I applied, but also by applying to a program that gets fewer applications, right? So again, use these facts to your favor. And you can really reduce the stress around applying and help you get in the first time around. So ask those questions. Does your school require an interview, right? Not all schools required one. I didn't interview as part of the school, but they probably didn't need to because I was in the admissions office 4 or 5 times anyway, right? Be prepared for questions on student debt and income. They love to ask you guys that because they love to make you sweat, right? And they know that those questions about numbers, particularly money, stresses out veterinary students, right? So they're going to see how you respond to that. Just by knowing what a veterinarian makes and how much it costs, they're going to already be blown away. Does your school have all these requirements? Not all schools have the same requirements. We have some of these listed on Vet School Bound, some of the prerequisites listed per school. GPAs, some schools put more weight into those than others. The prereqs are quite different from across the board. Some of them have experience hour thresholds. Do you meet all of these? Do you meet these minimum requirements, right? So just asking them, look, this is where I am now. These are the areas that I'm worried about. These are the classes that I'm worried about. Maybe it doesn't fit nicely into that little matrix that they provide that shows the prerequisites. Ask them those questions. They're more than happy to answer those for you. All right, so coming into the home stretch here. So what recent vet school applicants have said. So Dr. Greenhill at the AVMC has been studying this as well from the pre-veterinary standpoint, particularly those folks who apply through the VIMCAS system. So they've got a huge data set there. And this is what she presented to us at the AVMA Economic Summit last fall. The cost of applying is a driver in where and how many schools to apply to, right? So the number of schools you apply to, that seems to make a difference, like the actual cost of VIMCAS. Applicants apply to 5 veterinary schools on average. Cost of attendance is not the driving decision factor, right? This is one of the reasons why we're doing this session tonight, right? We want to make cost of attendance a bigger deal because student debt is a big deal, not only for the society at large, but particularly in veterinary medicine, right? The fact is, it's going to cost you something on the order of what it costs a physician to get a medical school education, but you're going to earn a half to a third what physicians make after you graduate, right? So that presents some challenges. So you need to keep those costs down to the best of your ability. Past pre-veterinary students have also said they're willing to pay about $1,200 a month to service their veterinary school debt, right? And we're going to take a look and see what that means. But some of these are kind of head scratchers for me, right? So it's hard for me to wrap my head around the fact that applicants would be concerned with how much it costs to submit the applications, but not so concerned with how much it actually costs to attend veterinary school, right? So the cost of applying to 5 schools is about $2,500, right? If you choose one of the non-resident schools, it could cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars extra, right? So we need to get pre-veterinary students to consider the cost of attendance during the application process, right? And as I've used this example already tonight, but let's say that you apply to your in-state school and you don't get in, and you've applied to one of the Caribbean schools and you did get in, right? You're going to have a really hard time ignoring that offer of admission, right? So if you wait to consider the costs until after you know where you've been accepted, that's too late, right? You're going to go to one of those accepted schools, and it might be one of the most expensive schools. But let's go and review this poll, right? So the majority of you tonight said that you think it's going to cost between $200,000 and $300,000 for your veterinary education. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So willingness to pay about $1,200 a month to service their veterinary school debt. So we're going to put our math geek glasses on again. Under a standard 10-year monthly payment, that's the default repayment plan after you graduate school. So $1,200 a month, right, falls somewhere in here, right, closer to the $100,000 range. It is extremely difficult to graduate from any veterinary school with less than $100,000 of student debt, right? And that's the willingness to pay, $1,200 per month. If we consider it a percent of your after-tax monthly income, right? So even if you were to have that $1,200 per month, it's going to be a little bit more than 20% of your monthly after-tax income if you're earning $80,000 a year, right? And it just goes up from there, right? So this is what we're looking at for the majority of what you guys said is going to cost for your veterinary education tonight. A standard 10-year monthly payment, right, is $3,300. Now, thankfully, you don't have to pay that. There's other repayment options, but that's not doable with a new graduate starting salary, right? It is not financially feasible for you to dedicate nearly 70% of your after-tax take-home to a single expense, right? So if student debt stresses you out, find a way to prioritize obtaining a veterinary education for something less than this $200,000 mark. $1,200 per month, just again, to give you a little bit of perspective, it roughly equates to borrowing $110,000 of student debt, which again is very difficult to do for a veterinary education these days. That would be 24% of your monthly after-tax income if you were earning $80,000 a year. And if we wanted to use a metric that some of the financial quote experts would recommend, which is that you not pay more than 10% of your income towards your student debt, which essentially equates to a debt-to-income ratio of 1-to-1, you would have to make about $192,000 after graduating veterinary school, which might happen 50 years from now, but it's not something that current veterinarians are earning right out of the gate, right? So we have to adjust our expectations a little bit and take that adjustment and apply it to our veterinary school application strategy. So the best odds of acceptance usually aligns with your least expensive options for veterinary school. It's a win-win there, right? So get in sooner, finish veterinary school sooner, start becoming a practicing veterinarian. Usually that also aligns with the least costly way of obtaining that education. There's no Harvard effect. So if you are borrowing, resist the temptation to apply to those higher cost seats, particularly those private and foreign schools. Those are going to end up putting you in that higher cost profile that we talked about tonight, without a doubt. Explore creative options to increase your odds and decrease your costs. Consider moving to the state that is your first choice, right? I mean, that's not realistic for everybody, but as I shared with you earlier, if you're not able or willing to do that, well, you do have those handful of schools that will allow you to obtain in-state residency after the first year. Get familiar with those schools and bump those higher up on your list. And there's also those contract options or 2+2 programs that are, we seem to be adding a few more of those each year now. That's all the content I have. Pretty good. We're shooting for an hour, a little over an hour. Again, I want to thank the APVMA and Student Doctor Network for helping to raise awareness for this webinar. I hope you found it useful. I will stick around and take any questions that you guys have about what we've covered tonight, and please feel free to lean on any of those resources on VIN Foundation to help you make sense of applying smarter.
And Paul's going to add a few comments before we start going into the questions and answers.
Yeah, sure. Please do.
All right. So a big thanks to Tony and Student Doctor Network and the APVMA, everybody who sat through this. It's been a great presentation, and So one of the things that I want to address, some may be thinking, and I hear this from a lot of students, both before and during veterinary school, and that's why talk money. None of us went to vet school as money as our biggest driver, but the reality is that we see so many new grads, and it starts in fourth year, where the loans become real. And the best way for you to make that panic that happens at that point the least, and really be prepared for it, is to think about it now and do everything Tony's talking about trying to make school cost as little as it can so you don't have to worry about it as much later. The other point I wanted to make is Tony talked about the VIN Foundation cost of education map. And some of you may have noticed differences between that and the AAVMC cost estimator. And both are right, but they're looking at different time frames. The AAVMC map is looking at what it costs people who graduate today. What did it cost them to go through school? Whereas in the VIN Foundation map, we try to estimate what your costs will be for the next 4 years, because it doesn't really matter to you what somebody paid over the last 4 years. What matters to you is what you're going to pay and for that school when you go forward. And then the last one is that there are some discounts out there that really aren't advertised. One of them that I'm very familiar with is UC Davis, in that most of the school students there, whereas in most schools is only, and I'm not giving an ad for UC Davis, but just become aware that UC Davis has grants that they give to almost every school, every student, that can equate to, the good, better part of a year and worth of tuition. And they don't advertise it because it's not guaranteed every year. So they don't put that into what they advertise as their costs. But my point here is talk to current students at the schools you want to go to. Find out what is available to the students there. Find out what's not available. And, you might learn some secrets that aren't really readily available by doing research otherwise. All right, with that, I'll let Tony finish his break and start answering questions marathon.
Yeah, so I think those are great points. And don't be afraid to ask financial questions of these dean's offices and admissions office, right? I mean, even if they can't guarantee those grants, I mean, they have been giving those out for quite some time now. So it would take a major disruption for it to all of a sudden stop, right? But they'll tell you that if you ask, and then if you can factor that into your cost, then great. But every school that's on your short list, right, those top schools on your list of application, you should be asking those types of financial questions of, hey, I'm considering UC Davis. They offer a grant for all of their students in the amount of XYZ. Does your school do that, right? I mean, that is not that is a perfectly reasonable question to ask any admissions office for vet schools that you're applying to, right? I did want to, and I'm glad Paul brought the cost of education map back up, but there are certain schools too that, it's a little sneaky, right? And I'll use Pennsylvania as the example, right? They have UPenn is there, right? But that's a private school, and they do offer an amount for Pennsylvania residents, right? But you'll notice that Pennsylvania, UPenn for Pennsylvania residents is far from the lowest cost school for folks who live in Pennsylvania, right? So again, you have to kind of just expand your thought process in this a bit and start to compare where it might be less expensive for you to go no matter where you live, right? You may find that your state school is not always the least expensive school, right? It's the place to start, but then you have to use things like the cost of education map to expand beyond there and see what how they rank comparatively against all of the other schools that are out there. I did also mention the in-school loan estimator, right? If you're particularly confused about student loans, right? We have the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center, again, freely available. And one of the tools that you can use to get a flair for this is the in-school loan estimator, right? And you're in the planning to attend veterinary school category. This is the in-school loan estimator. It'll pull up this form that you can fill out, right? So you're going to select a school. Some of these schools that like I covered tonight, so Colorado State University, this is going to pull in the information from the cost of education map, right? And let's say that you're going to attend as a resident and you're going to start next fall. So we're going to start maybe August 15th or whatever the Monday is, maybe it's the 17th that they're going to start. You're going to borrow for 4 years, right? And now you can start to fill in the amounts that you think that you're going to need. You can quickly, if you're going to borrow everything, you can click this button and it'll divide it by 4, right? So close to about $60,000 per year for those additional for each year. And then we have to assume an interest rate. We know the interest rates on student loans are about 6.08% right now. They do change every year. It's likely that they're going to go up because they've really never been lower than this. So we'll probably have to do some assumptions on what that would be, right? But you can put any numbers that you want in here just to give yourself an idea. And this will give you how much interest will cost you, right? Again, this is another one of the reasons why this is such a big deal to consider now, right? Is because you can end up accruing during school interest in the amount that equals to another year of tuition, right? So in this case, if we borrowed all of the student loans offered to us, we would borrow about $249,000. We would accrue about $33,000 of interest while we're in school. And our starting repayment balance is going to be about $282,000, right? So you guys are right on point there when you said that your education is going to cost you somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000, right? But the lower amounts that you can borrow, so if you can decrease some of the living expenses or find some scholarships and grants or use those health profession student loans, you can greatly reduce this interest cost, get yourself down to a lower number than what we're showing you here. So you can use this as a way of ballpark estimating the amounts that student loans will cost you, assuming you're not able to find any other financing opportunities. All right. So if that's spurred any more questions, I'll kind of go through some of these other ones that are in here. I see a question about on-campus housing. Are there any vet schools that offer on-campus housing for students? And if so, is that something you would recommend looking into? Certainly, but when you do attend something like veterinary school, again, you're kind of in that graduate professional school realm. And the cost, the amounts that you borrow are going to still offer you living expense estimates. And oftentimes those living expense estimates are based on campus housing, right? So it may save you a little bit, but you're probably still going to pay for that. And whether or not you're borrowing that is really the key factor. If you are doing undergrad at a school that has a DVM program, will that increase your chances? That's a good question. I don't really know the answer to that. I think it really matters if you attended that undergrad program as a resident of that state, right? So if you went to Colorado State, so I'll use my wife as an example. She went to Colorado State for undergrad as well, but she was an out-of-state resident for her undergrad as well. I don't think that, I don't know, but I don't think that increase or decrease her odds of getting in, other than the fact that she was closely working with a lot of the clinicians there as an undergrad because she knew she wanted to go to veterinary school. So it does give you access and exposure to a lot of the clinicians who are also on the admissions board as well, right? So as long as you can that helps you put together a more competitive application, it may help you get into that school as well. But I don't know if there's any data out there that says attending school as an undergrad gives you a better or worse chance of getting into that respective veterinary program. You might ask the admissions office if they have stats on that. They may know if a majority of their admitted students come from their undergraduate program. That would be a good piece of information to ask them.
So we have multiple people asking if they are a Canadian student or international student, how does the residency work, and is it easier or harder for them to get in?
So they are Canadian students.
So one's a Canadian student that will be borrowing, is asking if they will be borrowing from the same place if they go to school in the U.S.
Yeah, so no. So if you're a Canadian, the U.S. student loans that I talked about tonight are only available to folks that are U.S. citizens or have some ability of documenting some form of citizenship. Canadian citizens, unless you're a dual citizen, you would not be eligible for U.S. federal student loans, which means that your student loans, the availability is governed by your provincial student loans and whatever kind of equivalent program that the government of Canada has. I know a little bit about Canadian student loans, but I am far from an expert. So you're going to want to find somebody else to ask those specific questions to. I'm not sure if it works the same way as it does in the States.
And someone else is asking that a couple of people want to know the answer to is how difficult is it for an international student to apply into vet school in the US? And I guess based on your previous answer, it's going to depend on which country they're coming from.
Yeah, which country and which school that you're applying to, right? So when I showed you the UC Davis application stats, there was a row there for international applicants. I think they had 20 or so international applicants, and they accepted 6, right? So it really is going to depend on whether or not you still check all of the boxes that each school requires of you. And as long as you do that and they accept applications from international students, then you may have a slightly better chance if they have certain number of seats allocated specifically for international students. So that would be the question I'd want to ask the schools that you're considering, right? So we could see in UC Davis, I don't know if they have a certain number of seats that they allocate for international students, but it appears that they offered admission to about 6 in this most recent class. You might ask them if that's the usual number that they tend to accept, right? So you can kind of gauge from the application statistics how many international students they accept.
So the most popular question that we have is if the loan forgiveness after working 7 years for nonprofit remains existing.
Yeah, so public service loan forgiveness, it definitely exists, but you do have to work for a 501c3 or other type of qualifying entity for 10 years. It's not 7 years. So 10 years after you graduate, you would make payments based on your income. And as long as you satisfy all of the requirements, you can apply to have your student loans forgiven after 10 years at the earliest. Right. So absolutely, that is an option that's available to you. I would not use that as a reason to pay more for your education than you have to. Public service loan forgiveness can help, but you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're relying exclusively on that because you went to one of the most expensive programs, right? It's great for those folks whose career interests align with public service, but you'll be amazed at how many times your mind is going to change during and after veterinary school in terms of what you think you're going to do. I mean, one of the great things about veterinary medicine is it opens up an almost unlimited number of doors for doing different things. However, it's hard for me to recommend to anybody that's considering applying to veterinary school now that they bank on working in public service for the 10 years after they graduate veterinary school. It's just, you're going to be exposed to so many things and your mind's going to change so many times that it's great a program to use when your career interests align with that program, but it's not something that I would go into veterinary school counting on. All right, I see a question here from a human resource manager for a veterinary organization and joined to learn more about student loans. And they're considering a student loan forgiveness program. Is there anything else that would benefit current future veterinarians that employers can provide? Ooh, that opens up a whole can of worms. So I'm glad that you're looking into those sorts of things and looking as an organization what employers can help provide new graduate veterinarians to help them with their student debt. Generally speaking, the best thing that they can do is pay them as much as they can afford to pay them and educate them on their student loan repayment options. Right? There are a number of student loan repayment employer programs that are going on out there right now, but we generally find them to not be very helpful, and they kind of interfere with some of the repayment options that are out there now. So I would encourage you more to educate those new veterinarians on those options that are available and help educate those employers too on where to help their employees turn. But I think that their funds are better spent increasing their salaries and benefits versus trying to come up with some program to address their student loans. Let's see, University of Florida used to offer converting residency after the first year. They don't offer this anymore. I don't know that to be true. I didn't know Florida to have that option available. They did fix, or they guaranteed the tuition for non-residents from the time you started to the time you finished was frozen, essentially. But I do not know Florida to be one of those states that allows you to change your residency status after you start the program. But if you have some information that conflicts with that answer, please send it on to me, studentdebt@vinfoundation.org, and I'm happy to reevaluate that.
Tony, one question here is, what is a reasonable percentage of income to pay towards student debt?
Ooh, wow, great question. The reasonable percentage are dictated by the repayment options that are out there, the income-driven repayment options that don't require any more than 10% of your discretionary income, right? So repayment is a whole new 2 to 3 hour webinar that we cover with veterinary students and new graduates. And we actually have a new grad webinar that's up on the VIN Foundation website that you can turn to if you're interested more in that. But for pre-veterinary students, focus more on reducing the amount that you borrow, which gives you way more flexibility when you graduate. So don't worry too much about the repayment options now. Focus more on reducing your student debt, which you have the most control over now based on which schools you choose to apply to. All right, I think we answered that one. Jordan, help me out with some of the ones that have some higher, do they rise to the top automatically? The ones that are, okay,
yeah,
cool.
We already answered that hasn't. So one question is, if you're doing an undergrad at a school that has a DVM program, will that increase your chances?
Yeah, we did cover that one.
How can you make your essay responses stand out more? I think that more goes to what you were talking about in terms of that there's other resources out there which cover that info.
Exactly.
What is the difference between starting salary and earning potential 20 to 30 years into your career?
Oh, yeah, that's a forward-thinking question. Yeah, so 20 to 30 years in your career, it really depends on the pathway that you take in your career, right? So the data that we have available for the AVMA, so the AVMA, you can look that up. AVMA does some biannual compensation surveys of veterinarians, and from some of the data that we have there, we see that your income increases at a pretty fast rate during the first 5 to 7 years after you're out of veterinary school, where you're learning to become a practicing veterinarian. You get better and more efficient. Generally, you're paid based on production, so how many cases that you see and the complexity of those cases, at least in the form of how much those cases generate in income. But then after that point, you can only see so many cases in a day, right? So your income tends to plateau. Then you either specialize in something, or you find some other way of earning additional income, or only focusing on particular cases that maybe command a higher income, or you go on to be a practice owner, right? And depending on what trajectory either of those pathways take, your income can go much higher, or it can go a little bit higher, or it can go down, right? It really depends. So 20 to 30 years out, the data that we have, your income will be appreciably higher. It's just that it doesn't tend to increase indefinitely, right? Again, a lot of this is determined unless you become a practice owner or a specialist. Your income is going to be determined or capped out essentially at the number of cases you can see per day and the amount that you're able to charge per case.
Okay, next question is, can the Department of Education staffer direct/indirect loans cover the entire veterinary program? Are there good options for anyone unable to secure a cosigner?
You don't need a cosigner, right? So the direct loans will cover up to the cost of attendance, right? So what the school says it will cost you, they will offer you that amount in student loans. So direct unsubsidized up to that first $40,500 for a U.S. school, and then the rest of it will be covered in those direct plus loans. Now, if you are one of those people that have really, really, really bad credit and you don't qualify for direct plus loans, then you would need a cosigner. That is extremely rare, right? I mean, I have done thousands of student loan consultations, and I think I've seen that twice, right? So that is an extremely rare circumstance. You do not need a cosigner on direct plus loans unless your credit is pretty bad.
Okay, as an undergraduate, which major would you say is an ideal major for a pre-vet? Microcellular biology, integrative biology? What are the things that a student can do to build one's resume during school? Could one work at a veterinary clinic?
Yeah, that's not something I'm going to cover here, right? I mean, you technically don't have to have a major in anything, right? You can actually just take courses to meet the prerequisites and not actually have a degree to get into veterinary school, an undergraduate degree, right? So whatever piques your interest the most, whatever is going to allow you to achieve those prerequisites needed for the veterinary schools of your choice, those are going to be the recommendations I'm going to make on that.
Okay. Is there a reason why Tuskegee University has the highest mean starting salary?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I do not know the answer to that. They do have a relatively low number of respondents in that particular survey. So that survey goes out in April, a couple of months before folks graduate. And for the 20 people or so who answered those questions for that year, they must have had a pretty good gig set up for after they were graduating. That may have skewed it. We'll have to see if that's repeatable in this 2018 data set when we get that this fall. But I can't answer the specifics of that question.
Okay. I've heard savings count against you for FA, FSA, but the cap is different for graduate schools. Savings above $15,000 are considered. However, I've had trouble finding this on the FA, FSA website. Do you have any resources for this?
No, I honestly would, your savings are going to be what your savings are, right? I mean, if you have $15,000 in savings, you're going to have to put that on the FAFSA form. I don't think that's going to affect the amount of financial aid that you're available to receive at the graduate professional school level, but you won't know until you submit the application. And I certainly wouldn't go out and spend it all just so you can get more in student loans, right? So I think that you'll find out when you apply whether or not that affects your financial aid, but my initial feeling on that is it's not going to. You have to have significant assets in order for your financial aid to be affected at the graduate professional school level. Sometimes we see folks who are married who have a spouse that has a pretty sizable income, still doesn't affect their financial aid award, right? So your $15,000 of savings, I don't think is going to appreciably impact your eligibility for veterinary student loans.
Okay. If I do not feel competitive for my in-state school, is it a good idea to get a master's beforehand to become a more competitive candidate? I'm concerned about how that would affect my student debt overall.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great and it's a complicated question because we do see more and more folks who go on to do masters before they apply to veterinary school. But that would be the exact question that I would pose to the admissions folks. Right. First, I'd want to know why you don't think you're a competitive candidate. Right. And if you already know the answer to those questions or the admissions office has already told you the answer to those questions, then I would be working to correct whatever those deficiencies are in my application. And if doing a master's will help with that, then great. Right. But it's not necessary to have a master's, and the school itself is going to be the one that is going to tell you if they put more or less weight into something like that, right? So that's where I would, again, don't be afraid to spend some time in that admissions office. Sit down with them, be honest with them, ask them, what they think about your application, tell them why you feel you're deficient in whatever areas it is, and you'll find out that maybe you don't have to do something as drastic as obtaining a master's just to make yourself a better applicant.
Okay, this is the last one that has multiple votes.
Okay.
Besides moving and applying for residency in another state or applying to a school that lets you get in-state tuition after the first year, what else can you do to apply smarter if you live in a state without a state school?
You've already nailed them both right there. So, I mean, if you aren't willing to move to a state that has a school that is your first or second choice, then I would be focusing my applications on those schools that allow me to obtain residency after the first year, or have a high level of support like Paul illustrated in the UC Davis example. See if there's some other schools out there that you can find that have, you know, consistent grants that they provide to their students. But those are really your options. But that's a pretty good, I mean, so the average number of schools that a pre-veterinary applicant applies to is 5, right? There's 5 of those schools that allow you to obtain in-state residency after the first year, right? So there are already a number of options there for you. So but just by doing nothing different. And then if you want, or you're able to move to one of those states, then you have to research what it takes to establish residency, right? Not every state is the same. In Colorado, it was actually pretty easy. All I had to do was demonstrate that I wasn't a full-time student when I first moved here. I had to get a license. I had to file a state tax return. And then the next time I was able to, or the first time I was able to apply after a year of doing that, I could say that I was a state resident of Colorado. Now, I've stayed there pretty much ever since. So that was a pretty good gamble on their part. But, you know, some schools it's easier to establish residency than others. So make sure that you understand that. Usually the admissions office will speak quite candidly about what it takes to obtain residency in their particular state.
Okay, I'm just gonna plug what you said earlier. Somebody asked ways to pay off debt, any programs you recommend. I'm gonna plug again that we did a webinar on May 29th called the Student Loan Repayment Playbook. And I just encourage you guys to go to the VIN Foundation website and look on the blog there. The whole webinar is there. It's definitely a longer one than this, but all that information is out there because there are a lot of different options. One other question is, do veterinarians who do an internship residency typically have higher incomes than those who do not?
Ooh, great question. Another can of worms. It depends on the specialty. And this is something, it's on my list of career ambitions, is to turn a light on the income of specialties in veterinary medicine. It is very difficult to find data on what veterinary specialists earn. Certain specialties earn more than others. There are very few studies with very few numbers of respondents from the surveys that have data on specialty veterinary incomes. But in general, the answer is yes, particularly true for surgeons, internal medicine specialists, neurologists, radiologists, pathologists, ophthalmologists, cardiologists. They're generally going to command a higher income than general practicing veterinarians. Some of that falls apart when we get into the emergency realm. Urgent care and emergency veterinary medicine is quite a high paying field right now. It's kind of one of the newer trends in veterinary medicine. So that can distort that quite a bit, but not all of the specialties have you earning more than a general practitioner veterinarian will make. So it really depends on the specialty that we're talking about. Someday I'm going to have better data to answer that question.
Okay, this one is with regards to the repayment programs, but just so that you can set the record straight. I'm a veterinarian who counsels a lot of veterinary students that don't have any plan on how to pay back their private vet school debt totaling $275,000 to $375,000. Many of them are counting on government forgiveness after 25 years of income-based repayments. Do you think this is going to be a viable option for them? Any other words of advice to guide them through this crisis?
Yeah, so that would be best covered in the new grad student loan playbook. There's a couple of statements in there that stand out to me. So private, if they're counting on income-driven repayment, then I hope they don't have private student loans, right? So because income-driven repayment and forgiveness do not apply to private student loans. It only applies to federal student loans, which is the primary reason why we recommend in the Apply Smarter webinar that you lean heavily on the federal student loans if you need to borrow for veterinary school, right? Because the federal student loans have the most flexibility and the best insurance baked into them than any private student loan that you can hope to find. So yes, the answer is, there has not been any changes to the federal student loan system, nor are there any proposed changes that are likely to pass Congress anytime soon. So particularly those folks who are starting veterinary school this fall and likely next fall, there are not going to be any changes to the current plans that are in place. Now, beyond that, it really depends on what Congress does and if they change how student loans will behave in the future. But I do not see any changes to the federal student loan programs coming down the pike anytime soon.
Okay, sorry, I thought I was unmuted. Given your professional opinion, what debt threshold do you feel surpasses veterinary medicine being a good career choice for the average person?
Can you repeat that one?
Yep. Given your professional opinion, what debt threshold do you feel surpasses veterinary medicine being a good career choice for the average person?
Ooh. That really depends on which path you choose after obtaining the degree. But I would say somewhere around the $225,000 range is probably where it becomes particularly challenging to pay back that debt, no matter what repayment plan you're using, with an average veterinary salary, right? And unfortunately, and just looking at the map now that's on the screen, you'll see a lot of them have numbers that are much higher than that, right? And all of the new schools that have come online recently are some of the most expensive schools, right? So you have to be really careful. I know there's a huge allure to attending the newest school, right? The shiniest building. But if it's also the most expensive price tag, it's going to be extremely difficult to pay back that veterinary education, right? So again, in my opinion, you're going to do your future self the biggest favor if you can keep your costs as low as possible, right? And that really covers a lot of the strategies that we went into tonight. That's a great question and a really hard one to answer, but that would be my best guess at where that threshold is probably too high.
I think a lot of these questions we can cover some of them in the follow-up. The Caribbean schools have the highest debt ratio. Is it true it is even harder to find a job after graduating from a school such as Ross?
Yeah, I don't see that to be true necessarily. Like I said, it's never been a better time to graduate from veterinary school, right? I mean, the private practices are really looking for warm, licensed bodies, right? They are not too concerned with where you graduated from, right? So again, one of the reasons why it doesn't necessarily pay more to pay more for that education, they're willing to pay you more no matter what school you went to, right? And they really don't care how much debt you're carrying when they hire you, right? They want you to be a licensed, competent, practicing veterinarian to help them with the number of animals that are coming through their clinics, right? So I don't think just because, I mean, and that may change, right? So when we're in a market downturn, yeah, you may see that certain schools are having a harder time finding graduates from certain schools are having a hard time finding a job from others. But right now, that does not seem to be the case.
Okay, I think that's a majority of the ones. You can take a quick scan here under the Q&A, but I think we've gotten a majority of the ones that are going to be relevant with regards to this webinar.
I see a question here. It says these cost estimates seem deceiving since some schools offer grants and scholarships which might significantly lower the cost. And yes, absolutely. But this is kind of the sticker price, right? Grants and scholarships, unless they're offered evenly to all students, right, which is pretty rare, right? I don't know very many schools that do that. That the example that Paul gave with UC Davis and the grant that they've been doing for a number of years is probably the closest that comes. But we don't often include those because they're not guaranteed, right? And not every student can get them. So you have to visit with those schools and ask them, okay, what is your scholarship opportunities? How many students receive them? What is the average scholarship that students receive, and how many of the students receive them, right? So if that's only, only a small number of people get a small amount of dollars, then it's not going to greatly impact or reduce your cost of education. And I wish there were more consistent grants and scholarships available throughout all of the veterinary schools, but that's just not the case. So ask that question to the schools that are on your short list, have them give you a sufficient answer, and then bake that into your own cost estimate for school.
One more question is, somebody said the odds aren't as bad as you say for out of state vet schools. You're eliminating consideration of the wait lists, which can move up to approximately 130 seats. Iowa last year, I believe the overall applicants to seats all around is 2 to 1 per seat.
Right. If you pretended that every seat was equally weighted, then the applicant to seat ratio is 2 to 1, right? But they're not all equally weighted, right? So, another example, Colorado State, there's 140 or so seats, 145 seats. I believe 75 or 80 of them are allocated to in-state residents, right? They're not equally weighted. So, and regardless of the non-resident stats for the school, I mean, the two examples that I showed you, there's a stark difference between the odds of getting in as a non-resident versus a resident. The odds are still much more in your favor applying as a resident versus a non-resident for most of the state schools, right? So research those specific schools, look at the numbers for yourself. They may not all be as, 4% or 8%, the ones that for the two examples that I used, but they're not too far from that. Right. And I would much rather have a 45% chance in the example of LSU than the 4% chance for the non-resident. Right. So even if that's a slight underrepresentation, my chances of getting into LSU as a resident are much higher than as a non-resident.
Okay, 2 more here. One, is it possible for you to delay paying loans from undergrad by directly entering vet school after completion of your undergrad?
Yeah, that will actually happen automatically, right? You do not have to pay your undergraduate student loans while you're in veterinary school. They will go into automatic deferment. So you don't have to worry about using your veterinary school loans to pay back your undergraduate student loans. And you shouldn't do that.
Another question is, what information do you know about transferring schools? For example, if you don't get into your number 1 and would like to transfer to it for the 2nd year of school.
Yeah, that's really school specific. I do see some of that happening because I can see that happening in their student loan data. I would say that it's an increasing occurrence. Some schools allow you to do it easier than others, but you're going to need to check with the schools that you're considering transferring to in order to see what they're going to count and how easy that's going to be.
Someone mentioned that you said there's a list of schools where you can apply for in-state residency after the 1st year. Where is that list? You can send that.
Yeah, so that list is on the. I went through it, and you will all have access to this presentation. But I put that list of schools in this presentation. They are also indicated in the cost of education map, and you'll see them routinely rise to the top or the lowest cost ranking in the cost of education map, strictly because you have the opportunity to switch your residency status.
Okay, one last question. I asked this question earlier, but it was not answered, so I'm sending it again. I'm interested in pursuing a PhD as well as DVM. How could I apply smarter when applying for programs that offer dual programs?
Yeah, sorry, I missed that one. So that's also going to depend on the dual program, right? Some of them will actually cover your PhD, right, while you're doing the combined DVM, right? But it also then depends on how long it takes you to do your PhD and how the program is broken up. So they're extremely program specific. Some of them, I know when I was at CSU, you were allowed to start the first 2 years with the veterinary class, and then you went on to do your PhD, and then you came back on after you finished your PhD with a different veterinary class to finish it up. So it's really going to depend, and not all of them are structured like that, right? So it really depends on which program you're targeting and how they divide it up, right? So if you borrow, if any of the programs have you starting veterinary school before you start the PhD and you have to borrow some of the student loans to cover that, then you're definitely going to want to make sure that that is at the in-state rate, because you'll still continue to accrue interest during that PhD program, right? So let's say you start the first 2 years of veterinary school and you have to put a 4-year pause on completing the veterinary program to finish your PhD. That's 4 years of interest that's accruing on those 2 years of veterinary student loans. So you want those loans to be as low as possible, which is going to be if you're attending as a resident of a state school that offers a program like that. So it's really going to depend on the specifics of those dual programs, whether or not they automatically or hopefully allow you to pay the in-state rate during that, and then how much you're borrowing before you have to do the bulk of the PhD. Right? Because again, that time is going to add interest cost to your student loans. I hope that answers it specifically. If you want, you can send me an email and some of the programs you're considering, and we can look at the details together. But that's really going to depend on the specifics of the program that you're looking to do.
Wonderful, great. There's a couple other questions here. I don't know if you want to keep going or.
We can cover some of these other ones either via email.
Yep. So you guys can email studentdebt@vinfoundation.org. I put that email initially in the chat, and we will also be sending out an email to everybody that registered within the next couple of days with a recording of this webinar, along with additional helpful information and links and resources. And all of this information, along with the email information, will be in that email that we will send out for you. Tony, any other last words? I think if we can stop at 7, that'll probably be great for people.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea. But thank you, Jordan, for all your work going into this and getting the word out too. And I think I think we have to do more of these, right? More of these targeted to pre-veterinary students, because for too long, I think we've been busy trying to help those folks navigate their student loans that they currently have and making the math work on the other side of veterinary school. But when we get to the nitty gritty of it, if we can help you not borrow as much before you even get to school, right? So not put yourself in the position to borrow some of the higher amounts that we see, then it can be much more manageable to pay back a veterinary education once you finish, right? We do need the best and the brightest in this profession, and we want you to stay, right? That's what we, there's some studies coming out that are quite concerning in terms of the mental distress that veterinarians are under, and student debt is a big component of that, right? And there's not much we can do once the cake is already baked, right? We can tell you your options, but a lot of it's going to come down to your personal specifics, the repayment options, and how much debt you have. Before you start school, you are in the unique position to control how much you're going to have to borrow. And you can do that by using the strategies that we talked about tonight.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Keep a lookout for that email that you will see in your inbox in the next couple days. And as Tony has said, if you have any other questions, studentdebt@vinfoundation.org. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.